can speak back to those expectations and maybe even lead us to a different place. I think it's important when we talk about literature to begin with a sense of our relationships to the land beneath our feet. And while I realize that we are all coming to this presentation from virtual spaces, some of us perhaps here in Eugene, Lane County in Oregon, across the United States, maybe even across different ponds, I want to begin first with the Territorial Acknowledgement, both to recognize the indigenous histories, cultures, peoples, and communities that continue to call the Willamette Valley home, and also as a framework to think about what I see a lot of indigenous literature also doing, and the work that I see it doing in the world. So the University of Oregon and the city of Eugene are located on Kalapuya Ilihi, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, the Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, Kalapuya descendants are primarily citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, and they continue to make important contributions to their community, to the UO, to the lands now known as Oregon, and to the world. Now, as a citizen of the Cherokee Nation from Oklahoma, which is halfway across the country, a nation that was itself forcibly removed from our homelands in the Southeast in the 19th century and relocated onto the homelands of others who did not consent to our being there, it's important for me, as a Cherokee person, to think about my relationship to Kalapuya Ilihi, to the histories, cultures, languages, practices, beliefs, relationships, philosophies, peoples, and other than human kin of this place. One of the crucial things that I think territorial acknowledgements like this encourage us to do, and indigenous literary and cultural production more broadly, is to get us to think about those relationships. They challenge us to acknowledge that there are alternative histories to the places that we all walk upon, and to at least consider that by virtue of our shared history in the Americas, we all live and work in what remains in significant ways Indian territory. Territorial acknowledgements call us, I think, to account for those histories, and they unsettle us a bit to some of the stories that we've inherited, and to the challenges, and they challenge us to begin to think a bit more critically about those stories and the sources of those stories. One way to think about story and its impact on our shared imaginaries is right here at home. One popular story of the emergence of the state of Oregon that many of us might be familiar with goes a little something like this. It would begin with the travels of Lewis and Clark, leading to their mappings of the West, their discovery of the Pacific coast, the opening of the Oregon Trail, and the heroic settling of the West by pioneers, the agricultural and industrial development of the resources of the state, particularly here in the valley, and the arrival of civilization and progress to the wilderness and the savagery of the region. A version of this story was, until very recently, inscribed in bronze into our own built environment here on campus. And it remains a significant narrative, I think, through which the state of Oregon and the West more broadly understands itself. These public commemorations, controversial as they are, they don't so much represent history itself, then they provide an imaginative vision of the past that celebrates a very specific set of ideals, values, beliefs, and stories, often at the expense of those from other peoples, places, cultures, and communities that are erased or excluded. Like the acknowledgement, this map encourages us to embrace a different story of the place that we live and work. It captures the incredible cultural, political, linguistic, and ethnic diversity of indigenous peoples and communities for whom these lands were and continue to be political territories, cultural homelands, and sacred spaces from time immemorial. Stories, histories, experiences, and relationships that are marginalized or erased entirely from pioneer and other manifest destiny narratives. Indigenous literary and cultural production of this region, whether, for instance, in Kalapuya oral histories held by Siletz tribal member Esther Stutzman, poetry by former Oregon Poet Laureate and Warm Springs tribal member Elizabeth Woody, short stories about super aunties by Yakama Nation citizen and fellow colleague here, Michelle Jacob, or tribal public school curricula that's currently being developed by Indigenous and non-Indigenous partners. All of these stories recover and revitalize these and other stories and histories, refusing the erasures, elisions, relocations, and dislocations of Indigenous peoples and places that often frame white settler narratives of this place. They remind us of promises that were unkept treaties unratified or unrealized, and the ongoing reverberations of these and other dynamics into our contemporary moment. They force us, for example, to contend with, locally, how we went from this to this, which is the present-day location of the 9 federally recognized tribes here in the state of Oregon. And they force us to contend with how stories continue to impact our present moment. If we expand this on a national scale and think about Native American literature more broadly, it works to similar ends. Not only to imaginatively, creatively show that colonization exists and continues to impact Native lives and lands, but also how it came to be, how it impacted indigenous families, communities, cultures, and nations, and why understanding these histories is important. Put differently, I think indigenous literary and cultural production reminds us of the historical and ongoing structures of colonialism that continue to impact indigenous lives and lands and that structure indigenous and non-indigenous relations, or how in a period of less than 500 years, which is a drop in the bucket in indigenous history or in human history, we went from Indian country looking like this in 1491 to looking like this today. The same story on a national scale. And so I think what Native American literary and cultural production forces us to contend with is the settler colonial history of the United States and also the state of Oregon, Lane County, and the University of Oregon itself. In my classes, I like to introduce some useful terms that we can use. So we can think about settler colonialism, I think, in a few different ways in United States history. Oftentimes in U.S. history, we think of colonialism as something that ended in 1776, right? That we ceased to be colonies, we ceased to be under the thumb of the British government and became a nation in our own right. And though we've gone through trials and tribulations over those the next couple of hundred years, that we left our colonial history in 1776. If you look east from Indian country, we have a bit different sense of relationship and history. We understand settler colonialism to be a form of power and an ongoing structure of relations between indigenous, settler, and other populations that are predicated fundamentally on the elimination of indigenous lives and lands and its replacement by settler social, cultural, and political lifeways. To be a settler or a colonist or an explorer or a pioneer is fundamentally to lay claim to someone else's homelands. In order to lay claim to that homeland, you necessarily need those peoples that are already there need to be eliminated. And so we think about settler colonialism then not as something that is in the historical past or an event, but as a structure that conditions and informs our relationships that's ongoing and that impacts indigenous lives and non-indigenous lives in particular ways. On the flip side of that, if colonialism and settler colonialism is this structure, I think Native writers are also fundamentally and have been for a while interested in what is decolonization, right? And thinking about this decolonization as a self-determined practice of liberation that's grounded in a critique of settler power, so making visible that these structures exist, that these histories exist, and that these ongoing relations are impacting all of our lives, and then engaging, using that critique as a way to engage in projects of recovery, revitalization, and innovation, whether that's language revitalization, whether it's recovering indigenous histories, whether it's telling more complete histories of the places that we live and work. And so decolonization and colonization go hand in hand, obviously, but decolonization is linked to the affirmation of the things that settler colonialism seeks to eliminate, which is indigenous life and indigenous land. And in affirming indigenous life, Native American literary and cultural production is also about future, indigenous futures and futures for all of us. In our own moment, for example, indigenous literary and cultural production provide crucial entry points for some wider conversations around race, representation, gender, and justice that are taking place nationally and around the world. From sports mascots that defame and derogate indigenous peoples in the name of honor, particularly in a team that's located in our nation's capital, to stereotypical representations that hypersexualize or exoticize Native women's bodies and that commodify indigenous ceremonial items to make a buck, to a centuries-old archive of misrepresentation and commodification that permeates every level of our society here in the United States once we're made aware of it. And I think that's one thing indigenous literature and cultural production more broadly does, and they make us aware of these archives of misrepresentation. In fact, I think the contemporary debates that we're currently seeing, from environmental and treaty rights movements at Standing Rock and elsewhere, to the controversy around mascots, to missing and murdered Indigenous women, to the debates we're having around commemoration and memorialization, they're all embedded in an over 500-year archive of representation of Indigenous peoples by non-Indians, an archive that touches every single one of us in one way or another. In fact, I think one of the cool things about most Native literary and culture production is that it speaks to both Native and non-Native audiences, because at the end of the day, we're all wrapped up in these dynamics together, though in different ways and certainly with different effects on our lives. The Dakota scholar Phil Deloria, in his book Indians in Unexpected Places, talks about the way in which mass culture works on us, all of us, in our contemporary society. He says, as consumers of global mass market culture, we're all subject to expectations. They sneak into our minds and down into our hearts when we aren't looking. He goes on to talk about how these can sometimes be unconscious, right? We absorb an expectation or an image of Indianness from a Western or from a Disney film or from a song or from a play or a poem, and that becomes the image of Indianness that we all carry forward with us. In the United States, until very, very recently, the archive of those images was relatively limited. And so what Deloria reminds us, he says that Native nations and peoples have all too often been interpreted through the lens of Euro-American expectations that are formed in many cases in ways that further the colonial project. He goes on to say that to critically study Native American Indigenous literature and history and culture is to consider the kinds of frames that have been placed around this shared past that impacts us all, and to ask how we came to certain tellings and not others. If we think about the Indian that's constructed in popular culture, then I think we can make a distinction between Indigenous people, Cherokees like myself, or Kalapuya people, or folks from the 9 tribes here in Oregon or across the United States and across the continent and the world, and the distinctions between Indigenous people and the Indian or Indianness as a construct that's produced in culture and produced in society, and that informs the way a lot of people, Indians and non-Indians, like understand Indianness. So Native scholars like Gerald Visner, Lewis Owens, Leanne Simpson, a host of others, Sherry Hundorf, a host of other people, have drawn our attention to the fact that the Indian in popular culture, when we see an Indian warrior riding over the plains in a John Wayne movie or standing next to Leo DiCaprio in a contemporary frontier narrative, oftentimes what we're seeing, though we might actually be seeing a Native actor, the Indian that's being portrayed there has very little connection to actual Native peoples. So the Indian, we might say in pop culture, signals not the presence of Native peoples, but their absence, their erasure. As soon as that Indian rides over the hill, you're not seeing Native people, you're actually experiencing a moment of Native authenticity and Native life being erased. Because so much of our understandings of Indians and Indianness is confined to the past, the Western is the perfect, or frontier romance is the perfect genre, because it's often set explicitly in the 19th century or the 18th century. Because our ideas of Native people are confined to the past, it also means that Native people don't exist in the present. I have this story where I went into an elementary school to do a study or an exercise about Cherokees and about modern Native people to a 3rd grade classroom. And one of the students, when I got done with my short presentation, and I had identified myself as a citizen of Cherokee Nation, the student said, "But I thought all the Indians were dead." And I can't tell you how many times my colleagues, Native students, and others have very similar stories. And so because we're often framed in the past, a lot of people are unable to actually conceive of the possibility that we're still around, that we're still here, that Native people are existing in the present. And if you don't have a present, how can you have a future? So the Indian then, as a construct, as an image, as a discourse, as an ideology, we might say, it is what Gerald Visner calls a terminal creed. And he's talking about here using terminal in a couple of different ways. He's talking about there's a point at which Indianness can't go beyond. We can't move past the 19th century. We can't be modern people. We can't exist, and do modern things in modernity. But he's also talking about it in terms of reaching the end of a life, right? That you get it. That to be an Indian or to be caught as an Indian in Euro-American imaginary is to be given a terminal diagnosis, because the end of every Indian, whether through removal, through assimilation, or through other forms, the end of indigeneity in a Euro-American imaginary is typically through vanishing, through death or disappearance, one way or another. So if we think about the Indian as a construct in those terms, we begin to understand that these representations have a politics and that they exert real-world effects on Native people. For instance, they sanitize, if we think about the Western or images of Indianness from popular culture, they risk sanitizing the actual violence and dispossession of conquest or ethnic cleansing. They might even justify racialized ideologies of progress or manifest destiny that depend upon the dispossession and exclusion of indigenous people. To have a limited number of or limited archive of images or ideas or expectations about Indianness also reduces the incredible diversity and the lived realities of hundreds, if not thousands, of Native communities. 573 federally recognized tribes, dozens of other state recognized and many unrecognized, into a single or singular category of knowledge or representation, the Indian. When you reduce that diversity, it reduces the possibility of what we're able to imagine of contemporary Indians and the lives that they live. And, fundamentally, it denies Native peoples full personhood, political equality, and moral worth as indigenous peoples. We recently had a Supreme Court decision that came down, the McGirt decision, where Justice Gorsuch, for the first time in many years, held the government accountable for its treaty responsibilities and obligations to Native people, and in many ways reauthorized the Muskogee Creek Reservation, or recognized that the Muskogee Creek Reservation in Oklahoma was still a political and legal jurisdiction. That is an example of ways in which Native personhood, once recognized, can be a really transformative thing. So, as mentioned earlier, we can see taking these kind of abstract ideas and putting them to work in literary and cultural studies. We can see these dynamics at work in our own built environment here at the University of Oregon. Though things are rapidly changing almost every day, there still very much exists this dominant narrative that celebrates the pioneer ethos and the racial project of manifest destiny, both of which depend oftentimes upon the violent uprooting and dispossession of indigenous people and the exploitation, marginalization, and exclusion of Asian, Black, and other ethnic groups. So commemorating that history in statues like this isn't only to celebrate these dynamics, because as we said earlier, statues aren't history. Statues are just certain parts, a certain imagined understanding of history that societies choose to celebrate and affirm. So to celebrate and affirm that pioneer narrative as the only narrative and the primary narrative is necessarily to celebrate the violence, the dispossession, the exclusion around which Oregon history is centered. But it's also to erase other peoples and other experiences. The Cherokee writer Thomas King captures the challenge such narratives present, as well as the opportunities Native writers and cultural producers have to carve out some space in the ruins of stories like this, or the ruins of representation. King, in his book, The Truth About Stories, is talking about contemporary Native writers. And he says he makes this observation that, if you look at the time that he was writing in 2005, that a lot of Native writers don't really go back they don't write historical novels. They don't go back into history. They don't tell alternative histories. That's changed now in the intervening 15 years quite a bit. But I think King's onto a point here. He says what Native writers discovered was that the North American past, the one that had been created in novels and histories, the one that had been heard on radio and seen on theater screens and on television, the one that had been a part of every school curriculum for the last 200 years, that past was unusable. For it had not only trapped Native people in a time warp, it also insisted that the past was all we had. No present, no future, and to believe such a past, King says, is to be dead. Faced with this proposition and knowing from empirical evidence that we were very much physically and culturally alive, as I am here today, Native writers began to use the Native present, he says, as a way to resurrect a Native past and to imagine a Native future. To create, he says in words, a Native universe. Now, Native American literature as we study it in the academy today, and the popularity, the increasing popularity of Native writing and Native media didn't really take root until the 1960s or the 1970s during the Civil Rights Movement, the Red Power Movement, as a response to federal Indian policies that tried to dissolve the nation-to-nation relationship that tribes had with the federal government through treaties and other mechanisms. It was a shift, I think, also to sovereignty from federal policies that tried to deny tribal nationhood. And out of this political movement, you had artistic and intellectual movements. I think you'll see one thing about American history and history more broadly. Anytime there's a mass movement, there's an aesthetic movement and an intellectual movement that's walking hand in hand with it, and they're all mutually informing one another. And so you had the American Indian movement that emerges in the 1960s. You had Native writers like Scott Momaday begin to publish fiction and to get widespread acclaim. You had Native intellectuals like Vine Deloria Jr., who wrote his seminal text, Custer Died for Your Sins, which really presented one of these alternative histories and took readers to task for erasing Native people and not taking seriously tribal communities and tribal nationhood and tribal sovereignty. You had students on campuses like ours, indigenous and other students of color, who began to demand to see themselves in front of the classroom, on syllabi, in books, preferably written and taught and conducted by people of color themselves. And so you get this institutionalization into the academy, the emergence of ethnic and Native American studies programs, and a focus on contemporary Native writing. Writers who are picking up European genres, like and American genres like novels, poetry, drama, fiction, biography. They're all of a sudden, because of this political activism, there's an audience for this. And there hadn't really been a widespread audience, at least not in the way that it exploded in the 60s until that moment. So though Native literary and cultural production didn't find this audience until the 60s and 70s, it exists in a long tradition, I want to argue, of indigenous cultural expression in other forms. So one thing that I like to do in my class is to complicate how we think about literacy and the literary, right? And how we often privilege literature and the literary over other expressive forms. And so one of the things I like to do is complicate our history. Now, I just said Native writing didn't have an audience until the 1960s and 70s, but that doesn't mean Native people weren't writing before that, and it certainly doesn't mean that we weren't committing images to materials like paper to document our histories, to tell our stories, and to tell the stories of our families and communities. Here are just a few examples. Mayan codices, which are ceremonial and performative texts, birch bark scrolls that are Anishinaabe traditions, wampum belts from Haudenosaunee communities in the Northeast, winter counts from Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, and other plains communities. And then taking up things like alphabetic writing and print culture, like my own tribal nation, the Cherokee Nation, did, and committing our own language to print so that we could not only communicate with one another, but have records of our interactions with each other and also our interactions with the federal government. I also like to think about the literary, though. So it's not just about images on texts. It's also about the multiple other expressive forms through which Native people express our cultures, our traditions, through which families mark their own cultural productions. So we have, Southwestern rugs. We have Pueblo pottery, Cherokee double-woven basketry. We have the totem pole, the carving, the incredible carvers here in the Pacific Northwest that tell stories about communities, tell stories about families, tell stories about specific artists. We also have beadwork, an extensive beadwork tradition all across the Americas. This example here in the bottom right is Anishinaabe beadwork and the floral designs that characterize that from a very particular tribal community. And then we also have visual artistic traditions. So when we think about the literary, all of these forms of cultural expression exist in conversation with contemporary Native literary and cultural production, including not only novels, short stories, poetry, drama, biography, but also film, comics, games, podcasts, and other forms of new media. In my classes then, and in a lot of classes in Native studies, we read both classically literary text alongside both traditional and contemporary media. in order to give both a sense of the breadth and depth of indigenous cultural production, in which Native peoples have always expressed our understandings and experiences in a variety of forms. Put differently, I guess you could say, colonization didn't bring literacy to us at all. What it did is it gave us some new tools to adapt into our own traditions and to continue doing what we've always done, to share our understandings of the past, our experiences and desires for the present, and to provide different and perhaps maybe more productive roadmaps into the future. So, Professor Brown, what is Native literature anyway exactly? Well, I mean, you've probably been able to arrive at some kind of a definition on your own or a working understanding, and I'd really love to hear those in the Q&A perhaps. We can talk about how you're understanding Indianness maybe a little bit differently or Native writing. But here's my own working proposition with the huge caveat that no definition can ever really capture accurately or fully the diversity and complexity of any expressive tradition, which, just as an aside, that's one of the fun things about studying literature and culture is that it always changes, it's always challenging you, and you'll crack open a book thinking you know what Native literature is, and you read Stephen Graham Jones' horror novel, and it makes you go back to the drawing board to figure out how to fit that in there. So for me, what is Native lit? A proposition. It's a vast and growing archive of literary and expressive culture produced by Native people. Within a wide array of historical and geographic contexts, from diverse social and cultural locations, across a variety of genres and forms, as we've seen, composed today in both indigenous and Euro-American languages. One of the really cool things I think about contemporary Native lit is that we're starting to see a reemergence in a lot of this literature of tribal languages that through boarding schools and other processes of assimilation had been kind of forcibly removed from Native communities for generations. And so you have authors now who are either fluent in their own languages producing novels, or folks like me come into languages for the first time after not having spoken them for a generation, 2 or 3, and that language is showing back up, right? There are also Native lit is structured in both, as we said earlier, tribally specific and more broadly what we might think of as intertribal or trans-indigenous terms, right? So you'll have novels that are set in a very particular tribal tradition, but there's also novels that talk about Native American life, maybe in a city or across history or across geographies in more comparative terms. And I think by virtue of our history, and by virtue of the settler colonial history of the United States, Native lit is explicitly political. I would argue that all literature is political, even literature that claims that it's not. That's a politics. But Native lit is political in specific ways, I think. And we have to remember that those politics are as complicated and varied and diverse as the communities and the writers that produce it. So you can't read a handful of Native things and think you got a handle on Native politics or Native literature. We got to read everything that's out there because it's as diverse as you might expect from other communities. I was going to talk a little bit about my research, but I think I want to go ahead and move. Maybe we can talk about in the Q&A maybe how I put some of these practices to work in my own book. But what I'd like to do is leave you with a couple of quotations by some folks who are really monumental figures in Native American literature, elders really of contemporary Native lit. N. Scott Momaday, who's a Kiowa author, and Leslie Marmon Silko, who's Laguna. And I'm drawn to these quotes because I love what they say here about imagination and the impacts of stories of all kinds on our lives. Because at the end of the day, what literature and I think aesthetic production more broadly does is it offers us up the opportunity to imagine otherwise, to challenge received knowledge and unsettle or maybe settled what we thought were our settled assumptions and expectations, to open our imaginations not only to other experiences, histories, cultures, and life ways that we might not understand or understand incompletely, and to open ourselves to multiple pathways into the future that maybe some of which haven't even been imagined yet. So Momaday reminds us we are what we imagine. Our very existence consists in our imagination of ourselves. Our best destiny is not to own a home or to get a good job, right? Our best destiny, Momaday argues, is to imagine who, what, and that we are. To imagine ourselves into being. The greatest tragedy that can befall us, he says, is to go unimagined. Leslie Silko, speaking specifically about stories, is making a similar point. She reminds us that stories aren't just entertainment. That don't be fooled. They're all we have, you see. All we have to fight off illness, and death. I think for Mamade, Silko, and probably every indigenous writer that ever bothered to pick up a pen or to peck at a keyboard, imagination and the multiple storied possibilities it opens for us are at once the stakes of creation and its ultimate reward. To bring things back home again, there are different stories being told on this campus now. At the amphitheater of the EMU, right across the street from Johnson Hall, we have the flags of the 9 federally recognized tribes flying side by side with the United States flag, symbolically representing that nation-to-nation, government-to-government relation. Since 2005, we've had the incredible building, the Many Nations Longhouse, which is a refuge for Native students, and kind of an embassy for Native people when they arrive on campus, a place where Indians can gather and others and eat food, share stories, and get to know one another better. We have Kalapuya Ilahi Hall, which is the first building on campus that explicitly acknowledges and honors the first peoples of this place. And of course, we have our Mother's Day powwow that's been going for 53 years now, and I hope is going to go for at least 53 more. Those are different stories. They're different than the stories that are represented in those statues. So I think indigenous literature invites us to compose these kinds of stories and to compose new stories specifically about everything that our families, communities, and institutions can be. And to use those imaginings, those new tellings, those new stories, to understand our responsibilities to our place, to the peoples and the relations where we live, work, and love. That's what Native literature means to me and why I think it's important. And I really look forward to our conversation over the next few minutes. Thank you for your time. Thanks for hanging out with me for a bit this afternoon. Wado.
Thank you so much. We do have a few questions, and Emily has 2, so I'll start with her first question. Emily wants to know, what classes can freshmen take with you?
Oh, with me. Freshmen can take a lot of classes with me. I teach English 244, Intro to Native American Literature. I'll actually be teaching that in the fall. Because it's a larger class, it'll be remote. But I taught it remotely in the spring, and I think I've got a pretty good system going with it. So that would be a good entry point for Native American Lit. I also teach a couple of different versions of English 361, which is in the register. I think it's entitled Native American Writers. And sometimes I teach that as a novels class, and we start with kind of indigenous authored novels in the 19th century and come forward to the present. A few years back during Standing Rock, I completely revised that class to address the issues that were happening in Standing Rock, some of the central questions that were coming to the forefront of our national conversation, and the explosion of visual and new media that came out of that movement, in addition to conventional literary forms. And so I offer another version of that class that's exclusively focused on Native women writers, contemporary women writers, and I'll actually be offering that class in the winter. So look for that. And then at some point, maybe not your first year, but a couple of years down the line, I teach a Native American literature and film class at the upper division. And we look at, for a couple, 3 weeks, we look at the way Hollywood has represented Native people and the kinds of films they've been slotted into. And then we spend the last 7 weeks looking at contemporary Native cinema and the really exciting things Native filmmakers are doing, not only with the form, but also, with the genre, contemporary horror movies and ghosting narratives and all kinds of really cool stuff. So those are 3 of the opportunities. In Native studies more broadly, there's a ton of classes that are available in history, philosophy, environmental studies, education. And so, if you're interested in Native studies, please reach out to me, and I'd be happy to talk with you further about that.
Thank you. Emily also wants to know, why do you think Americans, specifically white Americans, have such a hard time talking about the hardships Native Americans have been put through by the U.S. government?
Wow, that's a big question with a lot of answers, I think. I think contemporary scholars, Deloria in his book, again, talks a little bit about that. And, to acknowledge, because I think we're so steeped for so long in narratives of American exceptionalism, right? The city on the hill, the refuge, giving you're tired, you're beaten down, you're poor. Because we have these narratives that America is somehow, some way different than any other human civilization that's ever flourished in the world, on the planet. It's difficult to, as we're seeing with the Black Lives Matter movement now, and as we're seeing across the globe, thinking about structures of anti-blackness and anti-Indianness, anti-indigeneity. I think it's difficult to contend with the fact that those celebrationist narratives they don't hold up under scrutiny, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think it's hard for folks to give up stories that they're very invested in and ideals that they're very invested in. At the same time that I think it forces one at some point to look inward and to really, as I argue about territorial acknowledgements, to ask serious questions about, okay, who am I? What is my family story? What is our story relationship to this place? And how is it that I can come into a more informed, ethical, and responsible relation to this place? That's hard work. Mm-hmm. It's easier, I think, to put on a T-shirt with an American flag and pop some firecrackers off on 4th of July. Not that either of those things are wrong in and of themselves, but it's easier to do that than it is to contend with, I think, a lot of the really crucial issues that Native and other ethnic American writers are challenging us to deal with.
Well, we certainly have commercialized the 4th of July a lot better than self-reflection and in this country, right?
Yeah. And I think that the idea of commercializing, like when something becomes commercialized, I think that adds a whole nother level of complexity to it, right? Because then it becomes a function of the economy and a function of how people make livings, right? And so to disrupt, it's kind of interesting. I've heard people talk about settler narratives as being really fragile. That if you pull out they're like built on straw. If you pull out one straw, things begin to collapse, and the reverberations of that collapse, reach out widely, into people's lives. And I would just say that, I think that's what Native people and Native writers show us for 500 years, that's been the kind of the forces that they've been writing against and living against and thinking their way through and out of in a lot of ways.
For sure. Thank you. Dimitri wants to know, do you see the destruction of Native peoples and cultures Pardon me, I'll start over. Do you see the destruction of Native peoples and cultures as an aspect of history that could very well repeat itself?
Oh, I mean, first off, I'd like to qualify. We might qualify destruction with the attempted destruction, right? Because what we see today is hundreds and thousands of nations and Native peoples revitalizing languages, coming back into relationships to their homelands, coming back into relationship with their extended kinship networks and their other than kin relations or the other than human relations. I see cultural revitalization happening. We see folks engaging with new media to make this happen. So I always push back when people talk about, the destruction of Native cultures as a given. That my presence here and the contemporary presence of Native people, will give lie to that a little bit. Not to say that it wasn't attempted, right? And certainly we've seen, I think, any kind of superficial study into U.S. Indian history will show us that actually proves the idea that things happen in cycles, right? That the overt violence, in the early colonial period was reproduced in the post-revolutionary period, had a little bit of a lull with the assimilation program in the early national period of the United States, that then intensified back again with violence and dispossession during the removals from the Southeast. The Civil War impacted Indian country in horrific ways that we are not part of the story of the U.S. And the Civil War. We see another lull in the late 19th century before assimilation and statehood and citizenship begins to kick back in, and the federal government makes a more earnest attempt to dissolve tribal nations and get rid of tribal land and to incorporate tribal people as individual citizens and nuclear families, and this happens over and over and over again. One indigenous legal scholar says that the federal Indian policy is a pendulum, and it swings back and forth about every 30 or 40 years for or against Native people. So absolutely, history can repeat itself, which is, I think, one of the really important reasons to study Native literature, to study Native film, to support Native artists, and to read Native history is precisely to arm ourselves with that knowledge so that we understand how and when and why and under what circumstances that pendulum might be ready to swing the other way. And both Native and non-Native people work together to prevent that to happen. I don't think just reading a Native novel will allow you to do that, but I think it's an entry point into coming to consciousness, as feminists of color would say, coming to consciousness of who you are and of your history and its relationship to Native people.
Thank you for that. I've got time for one more question, but I do also want to make sure that we let you know we've had a couple students in here, Paige being one of them, and actually a student who works for us who just told us on the chat that they are excited to take your class. They're registered for 244 and excited to take your class. So Arista wants to know, what are the ways we can research about Native American literature outside of the classroom?
Oh, that's great. There are a lot of resources. So outside of the classroom, it's kind of related to the classroom, but I would get on different university websites that have Native Studies programs and go and download people's syllabi. Downloading course syllabi from a variety of different institutions, taught from a variety of different instructors, will really give you a sense of like the breadth and depth of Native Lit. There are also, I think if you, you can get on, there are resources on the web. If you look for Native American writing, Native American literature, indigenous literature, that people that are constructing contemporary bibliographies of Native Lit. I know that some of the book vendor sites, if you search for one thing, they'll bring up other suggestions for you, and you have to be careful with those algorithms sometimes, but that's another way that I think you can do it. I always like to, if you're interested in children's lit or young adult literature, our indigenous colleague Debbie Reese has this incredible blog. I think it's American Indians and Children's Literature. And she's been doing this blog for, I think, over 20 years now, maybe even longer. And she's got an extensive bibliography of indigenous produced young adult lit. I think then just maybe, I would say find you a handful of Native writers, contemporary Native writers, follow them on social media, and then see who they're in conversation with, and then start following those writers. A lot of the ways that I hear about novels that have just dropped, or new poetry collections that are coming out, or a film that's about to go on the circuit, on the festival circuit, is through social media. That's the first way that I kind of hear about it. Academics, we're oftentimes a little bit behind the curve. We hear things a little bit late, and so social media is a way for us to kind of stay really plugged in. Those are some of the ways that you can read more about Native literature, and
take your class.
And take classes. Take my class and take other classes as well. Because the one thing about Native Studies is that it's a really interdisciplinary field. And so if you're taking a philosophy class, you'll likely read a novel. If you're taking an environmental studies class, you might read a collection of poetry. Simon Ortiz's From Sand Creek, for instance. Or if you're taking a history class, they'll probably work in a film or some other cultural production. And so I think Native Studies, by virtue of its interdisciplinarity, just taking other classes is also another way to get exposed to different kinds of Native Lit.
Thank you. That's all the time that we have for this session. For those watching, thank you for your time today. And again, if you're a student, please be sure that you log on to community.uoregon.edu to submit your reflection and stay on track to complete introduction. If you've completed your flock meetings to date and your advising prep module on the community.uoregon.edu site, you will have been invited to schedule your advising appointment, which will open class registration, like Dr. Brown's classes, for you. Make sure that you're checking your @uoregon.edu email every single day, and specifically for this advising information, we want to make sure that you get your appointment scheduled right away. For questions about introduction, about this program, or anything else related to introduction, you can visit our website at orientation.uoregon.edu. You can also email us at orientation@uoregon.edu or text us at 541-346-1159. Thank you for your time today. And to you, Professor Brown, thank you so much for helping our new ducks get ready for fall.
Well, thank you.